Okay. Um, so we've been looking at the rise of Rome, first as a republic, the growth of military, its expansion, the creation of an empire. Virtually at the same time, on the other side of the Eurasian landmass, similar kinds of phenomena were going on, which will lead to the emergence of a similarly huge and powerful socio-political system, which will be known to history as the Han Dynasty. But to get there, we have to sort of cover some ground first. And I want to start by quickly reviewing what we've seen with the Shang Dynasty. In Chinese history, there are sort of semi-mythological political organizations for which very little has been found in terms of archaeology or historical records. The Xia dynasty was considered the first and was the dynasty that led then to the rise of the Shang Dynasty somewhere after 1600 BCE, around 1600 BCE, or perhaps even a little bit earlier. Who knows? We're looking at the huge area of East Asia into parts of Southern Asia. We're looking at the Yangtze and Yellow rivers that create a dual river system, as we've already seen in Mesopotamia with the Tigris and the Euphrates. We also saw that there was a sort of a north-south split there, coastal interior, in terms of the two major initial cultigens, millet and rice, so that the Shang Dynasty, which really was a dynasty located more centrally interior, was a millet-based agricultural society. Okay, so the first leader of the Shang Dynasty, a leader by the name of Tang, removes a corrupt Shia ruler, takes over. In the sort of the semi-mythological portrait that we have, he reverses a drought, seemingly offers himself as a sacrifice. Turns up later he didn't really sacrifice himself. The Shang state was not a highly centralized political organization. There is a sort of an advancement in terms of consolidation. But yet at the same time, it's not a state with a clearly established borders. It doesn't have a capital city that is heavily defended against possible incursions from the outside. It tended to move around in response to changes in what would constitute the frontier. It will use horses from the northern regions that will be imported down together with chariots to create military dominance, but without actually going out and forcibly subjugate, as, for example, the Assyrians did, outlying areas, but rather that there is a confederation of states involved there, right? The Shang rulers then will use bronze specifically, the metallurgy surrounding the creation of bronze, to give them the sort of battlefield superiority over other groups that weren't into the true Bronze Age yet. They then moved to sort of consolidate and control copper mines and the sources of copper and tin, as well as controlling the artisans who worked in it to try and keep it secret. Interestingly enough, in our own world today, advanced military systems are the kinds of things that we also want to keep secret. We're willing to sell military systems that are not, shall we say, the top, the most dangerous systems around, because we want to preserve for ourselves and maintain our significant advantage over others. We also, when we looked at the Shang Dynasty, we saw a people who create, who probably didn't create the writing system, but certainly integrate the writing system into their way of life and ruling. We saw the interesting facet of the oracle bones, where the oracle bones are tied to systems of divination, trying to make contact with the spirit realm, who will then provide information about the future to help rulers predict whether they should declare war, get married, have the people start planting their fields yet, right? All of which will be tied to the underlying belief system of ancestor worship that functions both within the realm of the individual families, who would have altars dedicated to past members of the family who had passed on, but certainly much more so in terms of legitimacy of the ruling class, right? Past rulers were seen as divine, less in the sense that the pharaoh was, but somewhere that as they die and move on, they then become part of a sort of constellation of gods that control the weather and other kinds of things, and hence create the need for some sort of practices like altars in the homes and other kinds of things. Okay, so we're looking at the early Zhou Dynasty from 1045 with the fall of the last Shang ruler through the year 771. We'll see that the Zhou Dynasty will continue after that point in time, but actually it will sort of break up, and we'll get to that in a later lecture, right? Okay, so what was the prior relationship of the Zhou to the Shang? Apparently, they were nomadic kinds of people living in the areas to the north and the west of the central Shang Dynasty region, who come to an understanding with the Shang, ally themselves with them to protect the Shang as well as themselves from nomadic incursions by other, wandering tribes in the northern regions there, who would periodically come down, invade. And so over time, there is this kind of growing interconnection between these two. And certainly under the Shang itself, China was not a fully integrated empire. This is not a place where, say, like the Assyrians, or the Persians, where you divide up territories and assign them to specific rulers, who then come back to the central, the centers of power, report into the emperor on a periodic basis, right? No, these are sort of groups that are out there that are sort of in control of their own affairs, but, periodically would bring sort of tribute, which will become one of the facets then of the Chinese dynasty's relationship with outlying areas, rather than going out and forcibly conquering them and bringing them in under the umbrella of the Chinese Empire. They swear allegiance and demonstrate allegiance by fulfilling the need to bring in, products and whatever it was, animals, even women they would bring in and make them gifts to the emperor, things like that. Okay. So the Zhou will gain military superiority, defeat the Shang in 1045. But the Zhou, because they were much more sort of nomadic people, when they conquer the Shang, even though they have sort of begun to take on some of the cultural characteristics of the Shang, they are still, shall we say, a less sophisticated people, and they will then indeed copy the Shang's, many of the aspects of the Shang Dynasty's culture, system of ruling, things like that. Effectively, they will copy the Shang's unifying dynastic structure. What hold their dynasty together? Well, it was a patrimonial state centered on ancestor worship, right? So patrimonial means it passes from father to son as a patrimony of it. And it is based on ancestor worship, so that the ancestors and my direct genetic connection back, my genealogical connection back, is what gives me legitimacy in this system, right? An outsider would be seen as usurping, stealing the legitimate powers that belong to the family that has established the dynasty and kept the dynasty running. So the Zhou will take on the mold such that power passes down through individuals who can demonstrate that they are part of the genealogy of male ancestors, and hence there is continuity, hence legitimacy, and in their point of view, it flips the other way too, since that genealogy will reach back to the gods, right? And since there is this deep-funded sense of ancestor worship in China, dating back to the Shang, if not probably before the Shang, right? It is a fundamental basis for legitimacy. Yes, so on this foundation of the genealogy of male ancestors, right? On this foundation, they created an integrated and long-lasting dynamic structure that's going to last, right, several hundred years. And this structure was developed over time. So it wasn't just imposed with conquest, but it was sort of grown and developed by imitating what had been there in the past, and then gradually developing their own sort of ways of expanding upon it. This leads to a gradual process of political integration. Rather than a forced political integration through conquest, this is gradual over time. You begin to develop regional aristocracies that are out in the surrounding areas, and the Zhou are going to control a significantly larger area than the Shang themselves, right? The regional aristocracies will subordinate themselves to a single ruler, which is part of this process of political integration, right? And the book calls this a rather difficult balancing act between the central ruler and local lords. Okay. Even though this is a gradual ongoing process, the Zhou will eventually establish a dynasty with broad geographical influence so that their influence spreads. But at the same time, they have limited power over the regional states that are somehow subservient to the center. Um, what the textbook refers to as integration, but not quite unification. Unification will have to await the Qin Dynasty and ultimately the Han Dynasty, which truly creates unification um, as we saw in the Persian Dynasty, as we saw in the Roman Empire. Okay, now I want to turn to a significant aspect of the Zhou Dynasty, which is the development of a, shall we say, their major contribution at this point in time, okay, the early Zhou Dynasty, to the political systems of China itself in the form of what's called the mandate of heaven. In a sense, it had been in an early form articulated at the point when the Shang took over from the Xia. And the argument that the first Shang ruler, Tang, makes is that the Xia ruler had lost legitimacy and had effectively lost the support of the gods, and hence had lost out to the new ruler who was going to bring things back into order. A divine order would be reestablished in that way. The Zhou then have their own sense of the fact that when the Zhou rulers took over from the Shang, they make the claim of moral superiority as reflected in the fact that they were able to win on the field of battle. Yeah, it's an idea that we will see, and in a course like this, we can sort of reach out to other areas. We will see something similar in an interesting fashion with the emergence of Islam and the split between the Sunni and the Shiite aspects, varieties, sects, if you will, a fundamental split within Islam between those people who supported the so-called majority, the Sunnis, or those who supported the followers of a number of the children of Muhammad were seen as creating a special ruling line. We will talk about that point in another occasion when we do mention this. So the Zhou ruler will claim moral superiority as providing the basis for the transfer of power from the hands of the Shang ruler, who had obviously, in his corrupt behaviors, lost the support of the ancestors, and hence was replaced by the Zhou ruler, who will say, see. Okay, and so what we have here is a political ideology based on certain religious beliefs. They're not the first people to do it. Certainly, and from my point of view, certainly the ideology surrounding and underlying the pharaoh in Egypt, where the pharaoh claims to be not just the person who can predict the rising of the Nile, but who is ultimately responsible for it by intervening with the divine powers that bring the waters of life in the Nile. And if you're going to understand how for something like 3,000 years, 2,500 years, you have a pharaonic monarchy controlling it, well, if you can convince the people that you are the source of the waters of life, how do you rise up in rebellion against them? But as I suggested, and as some interesting historical, recent historical writings have indicated, the interdynastic periods in Egypt, when there seems to be a collapse in the dynasty, are correlated apparently with changes in the climate, such that the stress put on the social system by that fact leads to the uprising of people against the pharaoh. The system collapse. And as I said, if you live and die by an ideology in which you claim to be the source of the waters of life, and the waters of life stop running, well, ultimately the buck stops with you, and you will take the blame. And indeed, then once the waters of life start flowing again, a new pharaoh appears, a new dynasty with it. Peace and prosperity reign in Egypt again, right? So we see that connection between a sense of divine powers and a political system that somehow tries to claim legitimacy by connecting itself to that. So let's see. So it starts for the Zhou as what the text calls a religious compact, like a contract between the Zhou people themselves and the so-called sky god, their high god, right? And so what they see as the mandate of heaven is the sky god has chosen the leader of the Zhou to intervene, take over the reins of state, to sort of redirect government back to its true responsibilities in caring for the needs of the people. Ultimately, it will evolve into a fundamental Chinese doctrine, and you can see it even in the 19th century in the way that the Empress talks about it at that point in time, this kind of a thing. And here in the belief system, the idea is that since worldly affairs, what happens in the world, in society, are supposed to align themselves with the forces of the cosmos, with those of the heavens and the heavenly powers, right? It will be those heavenly powers that confer the legitimate right to rule on their chosen representatives. And often this is kind of like an ex post facto, after the fact kind of a thing, where indeed You win on the field of battle, and then you claim that having won on the field of battle, this is proof positive of the fact that the gods are with you, right? If the gods are with us, who can stand against us? Well, this idea has great continuity in human culture, and we see it here in the mandate of heaven, that the heavens dictate who indeed the ruler will be. And if you win in battle, then it's obvious that the gods have chosen you, and you have legitimacy by that very fact, which sort of suggests that might is right in a divine sense, right? Okay. Of course, this is very similar to what we saw in Egypt. If you claim that you're the source of the waters of life and they stop running, you lose your legitimacy, right? If you then are defeated by an outside group, well, you obviously have lost the mandate of heaven, and it must be because of improper practices. You did things that were incorrect, right? And in the future, dynastic legitimacy in the future, as we move forward with this in China, dynastic legitimacy, the legitimacy of a group to rule, the right of the sort of the legal right of a group to rule, will depend on ruling in accordance with the principles of good governance, and shall we say upright behavior, correct behavior, right? And so you may be the most powerful person in the world as the emperor of China, and yet the expectations are that you will see to the good of the people at large, right? Now, the Zhou will also pick up and use the practice of oracle bone writing. Indeed, combined with ancestor worship, then oracle bone writing and the underlying practice of divination, divining the future, asking questions of the gods, the ancestors, whatever those questions are, right? So that practice, as we saw, was part and parcel, particularly in the last 2 or 3 centuries of the Shang Dynasty, was part and parcel of court life amongst the Shang itself, right? Where the writing system was used, as you remember, to write on a scapular, a shoulder bone from a deer or something like that, or the shell of a turtle. You wrote on it, then you put it over the fire, but not in the fire. You sort of heated it up a bit, and then you looked at the cracks, and the cracks gave you messages. And as the system progressed, they wrote down the answers that those people who were trained in this art could read in the cracks, right? What's going to happen here with the Zhou is they're going to take the writing system and begin to expand on it in ways that, for example, more in Mesopotamia than in Egypt, where you really sort of that cuneiform writing system that was developed in conjunction with the temples as the sort of the core institution in the early Sumerian states. You then begin to use it to write other things, and ultimately literature and histories of the time and things like that. Something similar will happen with the Zhou, who then start by using it in terms of divination to sort of mimic the practices of the past regime, which they have inherited in a number of different ways. But then they will then begin to expand on the use of that writing system that has been developed into a variety of texts, some of which have been useful because they describe the organization and administration of government and have been the kind of thing that historians have indeed applauded. Okay, this goes over here. Okay, so one other thing that is very, very important to the future of Chinese society, that this writing will be tied to a more formal system of bureaucratic governance. You know what a bureaucracy is. I'm sure you've probably been to the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles. For me, historically, the growth and development of bureaucracy is kind of related in my mind to that whole dilemma of delegating authority to other people, which I say is, I've been sort of pushing it as one of the themes as we look at the growth and development of civilization around the planet over the last 5,000 years or so, right? Delegating authority to other people is always a dangerous game. Bureaucracy is one of the sort of the institutional ways that centers of power have developed to try and give power and restrict power at the same time. Now you walk into the DMV, and the DMV has a rather limited scope of what it can do. But if you need that damn license and you need your car registration done, and you get there and you get up to the booth and they say, I'm sorry, you haven't filled out form 8741-2, okay, which you need to get signed by. And you're going, but I need my car. I can't work without it. I might get thrown out of my house. They have a limited area of jurisdiction, but it is one of those powers of the state that has been transferred over to the institution known as the DMV. And in that role, then, they exercise the power of the state within that limited framework. So it's a way of giving power over and being able to assign rules and restrictions and this kind of a thing. And so the people in the DMV are only powerful in the context of the DMV itself. That guy who worked there, who could really screw you if he didn't give you the stuff you wanted, the day after he retires is nobody. He's a guy down the street who used to work in the DMV, but there is no power that passes over to that individual, right? Bureaucracies develop as a way of fragmenting up the power at the center and assigning it to specific individuals who are controlled and curtailed, limited in how they can exercise that power by a series of rules. And those individuals are nothing outside of the context of the institution that they work for. An interesting response to the dilemma of delegating authority. The Chinese will be one of the greatest practitioners of bureaucracy. And so it kind of begins with the Zhou, who now begin using writing in a much broader fashion, right? And so it starts with King Wu, who is, I believe, the second start of the 900s, 981 to, and King Wu is considered one of these fundamental foundational figures there. And he starts by appointing officials and military appointments and other things who are not related to them, who are not family. In other words, who begins to move outside the realm of kinship, right? And so you sort of, that level of trust that you assume you have with kin, people that you are related to, is not there now. And so you bring in other people. And often this will happen in the context where your kin, your cousins, your brothers, whatever, look at you as the ruler and are jealous of the power you have. And one way of curtailing and controlling their power is by creating bureaucracies, right? And so this whole complex issue of bureaucracy, seemingly boring for us because we sit in line waiting to get something done, historically is really fascinating because it touches on fundamental issues of power and control in society, right? He also, King Wu, instituted a formal legal code, Hammurabi in Babylon in 1750 BC, the Code of Hammurabi, right? Others before it as well, but the Code of Hammurabi, we discovered this beautiful column that had it carved on it in cuneiform writing style. So when you have a formal legal code, you need people who can read the formal code, right? This then created a need for bureaucrats. They needed to keep records of the appointments that were made, who was appointed here and there. After all, they're not family members, right? Okay, and they need to have some sort of a document that shows that indeed they were appointed by the ruler to serve as, these kinds of things, right? Legal verdicts. It's one thing to, in a court pronounce a legal verdict, but if you don't have a written record of that verdict, right, and someone challenges it 5 years later, what good will it do? All of this is then going to create the need for groups of scribes, scholars trained in reading and writing, what will become the literati, sort of a critical group in China that will last from one dynasty to another based on the difficulties inherent in the Chinese writing system, and often becomes something within families. But leave that aside for a second. These scribes, these scholars, will use their knowledge of writing to gain positions with the Zhou kings in the court, and positions of power in society. Ultimately, we're going to see the Han Dynasty around the time of Christ creating a university of 100,000 students who will then sit for standardized tests that will determine the level of competence that you have in the language and the knowledge of the classical writings and whatever, right? But that will then place you at a certain level within the bureaucracy of the state and determine what your life will be. The Zhou kings will also create a royal calendar. Now remember, we sort of looked at the pharaohs and how the pharaohs will be able to predict the rising of the Nile River. This then is something a little bit similar, right? The Zhou kings will create a royal calendar that sort of lays out And again, by studying the stars, and so there are people studying the heavens to be able to determine when the rains will come and when the rivers will flood, and the same kind of stuff that we saw in Egypt will kind of occur here, but be put into the format of a yearly calendar. And indeed, the Chinese can develop a yearly calendar with 365 and a quarter days, a 60-year cycle, right? They really do some extraordinary work in that regard in studying the heavens, the movement of the heavens. So in addition to agricultural activities, when people should go out and start planting, and religious ceremonies and rituals, all of which then, as exactly like we saw in Egypt, are ways of enhancing the legitimacy of the rulers, right? If indeed the rulers are the ones who put forth the calendar telling everyone when it will be the correct time to plant, within a certain range of days and this kind of a thing, and drive the society, and their predictions are relatively successful through the years, right? In the eyes of the public, this is a little bit like the power of the pharaoh, right, over the waters of life, all of which then in China make use of astronomical systems to develop the calendar and to put things together, right? The Zhou will also obviously build upon the material culture of the Shang, particularly in terms of bronze. It's going to make sense for them. In fact, what's going to happen is once they conquer and take over the Shang apparatus, state apparatus, they will bring in the Shang artisans to develop the bronzes for them, right? They will also use ancestor worship as a critical component of their politics. Under the Zhou Dynasty, the Chinese social order will become more integrated and more class-based. So as you travel around the country, local elites control the vast mass of society, who for the most part work on the farms that are in the hands of the elites who are there. The Zhou Dynasty will also, as others have in China, be tied to technological developments. And certainly the most significant technological development in China at this part is hydraulics, water control, building canals, irrigation ditches, expanding the rivers, connecting rivers together so that there can be the movement of produce from different areas, right? Ultimately, this process of sort of trying to create physically on the ground an integrated society will tie together the northern wheat and millet regions. Wheat had been introduced from the Middle East, but millet was sort of, what's the word? Domesticated there. It's too early in the course. I can't remember anymore. So the north with the south, the north with millet and wheat now, the south with rice, into a single integrated society. So this will build up over time, and yet there are limits to Zhou power in this society. Effectively, the Zhou never exercised nor had absolute control of an empire where they could make a law and it would travel to the far ends of the empire. It's not like that, right? The Zhou at the center exercise a degree of influence over the surrounding sort of consolidated states, if you will. with their own rulers and leaders and this kind of a thing, right? Um, the text says that the Zhou state at this time was first among many regional economic and political allies. There is an expression, first among equals. Well, they were more than equals, but it was close to that situation. Um, in Europe, in the Middle Ages, when you had a king who relied on the warrior barons who had their own castles and indeed their own private armies, the king was the first among equals, right? He was the king, yet at the same time, he was dependent on the assistance of his lords on the land, particularly if the realm is invaded. Those lords have a responsibility to raise their own armies and come to the assistance of the king, if you will. But each of those lords think, I'm really as good as he is, right? And who knows, maybe I should be king and not him, right? The Zhou will effectively rule over a much larger territory than the Shang had, and Shang had a more concentrated, and you can see that in the map in the book. But neither the Zhou nor the Shang had a highly centralized political system in place. In the system that they created, subordinates, okay, people who were out on the land, who were put in charge of different regions or who were there, those subordinates had much more autonomy than, for example, in the Roman Empire. By the 9th century into the 8th century, the power of the Zhou royal house was beginning to decline. And it will lead to a period of virtually independent states, the period of warring states, that is sort of the center doesn't hold, it breaks down, and increasingly each one of those confederated states seems to be breaking away and declaring independence with them. We'll be looking at that development in the next class, particularly because it will be tied to the growth of some of the more significant political theories and writings of China. Okay, so thank you if you have listened to this. All right.